Hello everyone and welcome to another video brought to you by Shooting the Dice. Today we are covering the notorious mobster Lucky Luciano's prison years. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to the channel and comment in the description box below. Born in Sicily in November 1897, Charles Lucky Luciano rose in the streets of New York City to become capo di capi, boss of all bosses, of the American Mafia. Luciano is considered the father of modern organized crime. He is in the top 20 most influential builders and titans of the 20th century, according to Time magazine. Although arrested multiple times for assaults, robbery, gambling and blackmail, Luciano's first and only prison sentence until the mid-1930s was a 6-month stretch dealing heroin in 1916 when he was just 18 years old. On the 6th of June 1936, Luciano was convicted of 62 charges of compulsory prostitution. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in state prison. Following his conviction, Luciano began his prison journey in Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossining, New York, which was a modern prison with sports teams and educational programs and was close to New York City. On the 30th of June, 3 weeks after arriving, Luciano was interviewed by Dr. L.E. Kienholz, assistant psychiatrist in the classification clinic at Sing Sing Prison. He described Luciano as a man of borderline intelligence who was addicted to drugs and money. Luciano told him that he wanted to be a barber in prison. When Kienholz questioned this, he found that Lucky had absolutely no experience of cutting hair, but Lucky thought it would be the easiest job that he could do. After reviewing the report, Assistant Prison Physician James Carney recommended that due to his drug addiction, Lucky should be transferred to the maximum security prison, Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, which was a better suited prison for addicts. Corrections Commissioner Edward Mulrooney also wanted Luciano to be moved after he visited Sing Sing on the 29th of June to observe the convicted mobsters. Others were sent down with Lucky when he was put in prison in 1936. To his dismay, Mulrooney saw Luciano presiding over a prison yard entourage. He said, "They were out in the exercise court, stripped to the waist and bathing in the sun. Luciano was walking around, waving his arms, apparently laying down the law to the rest of the boys." The commissioner immediately decided to separate most of the defendants. Subsequently, after only a few months at Sing Sing, Luciano was moved to Dannemora, which was and still is around 300 miles north of Luciano's old stomping ground and near the border with Canada. The prison is often referred to as New York's Little Serbia due to the cold winters in Dannemora and the prison's geographic isolation. Luciano hated it there due to the extreme weather conditions, and the long distance from New York City meant it was difficult for his cronies to visit him. That said, mobsters did visit him. Luciano continued to run his crime family from behind bars by first relaying his orders through acting boss Vito Genovese before he fled the States in 1937 to avoid an impending murder indictment, and then through his replacement, Costello. Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky was another to visit. He recalled Luciano telling him that summers are like a hothouse here. It stinks like a human being who's never washed in his life. In the winter, the wind comes right through you and you can see the ice forming on the walls inside. That's why we call it Siberia. It's the worst place in the world. It will be better to be dead than to stay here. Luciano was well respected by cons and guards. Convicted murderer John Resco was a fellow inmate of Luciano's at Dannemora. Resco was an interesting character. At 18 years old, he was involved in a small-time hold-up. He panicked when a shopkeeper resisted and shot him. He was sentenced to death by the electric chair, but spared at the last minute 3 times. Resco described Luciano's impact on the prison community. Life in prison picked up tempo after the arrival of Luciano and his partners. Cons and guards were constantly planning accidental meetings with Lucky, involved by curiosity, a desire to enhance prestige, or a plea for aid. Everyone around Luciano was approached at one time or another to intercede, to introduce, to pass on information. Lucky spent most of his days playing cards, strolling around the prison, and watching handball and baseball games. Inmates lined up in the rec yard to talk with him. There are contrasting views of how Luciano behaved in prison from eyewitnesses. The first was that Luciano was a humble man who just wanted to be like other prisoners. For example, according to Resco, though other convicts with less influence and less cash availed themselves of special privileges such as wearing outside shirts and tailor-made trousers, having special meals in their cells and hired help, Luciano, for one reason or another, refused all such favours. The psychology was excellent. He was never pointed out as a big shot because he wore a white shirt or had a guy cleaning out his cell. He was one of the boys, just another con. Leo Katcher, the biographer of Luciano's mentor, Arnold Rothstein, visited Luciano in prison shortly after he got the news of his failed final appeal in 1938. He told the mobster that he looked surprisingly good for his time in jail. "Why shouldn't I?" replied Luciano. "Lots of work, lots of exercise, no late hours, just what the doctor ordered. God, how I hate it." Luciano showed Katcher his hands from working in the laundry room. On the other hand, other eyewitnesses tell a different story. One guard observed, "Luciano practically run the place. He used to stand there in the yard like he was the warden." David Petilio, otherwise known as Betilio, a co-defendant convicted with Luciano in the prostitution case, became Luciano's personal chef and servant. He prepared Luciano's favourite food in a cell block kitchen set aside by authorities for his private use. In addition, in return for food and money, prisoners substituted for Luciano in the laundry, his pre-assigned job. He cleaned his cell and other prison chores, so he wasn't granted the barber's chair as he wished. I believe Luciano did take advantage. I think Resco wasn't close to Luciano in prison and wasn't aware of Luciano's perks. Although I think Luciano did do some work in the laundry, as the respected author Katcher saw the impact of the manual work on Luciano's hands, I'd love to know what you guys think. Please comment in the box below this video. I suppose what you have to consider is that if you had Luciano's power and prestige, would you make life easier and more comfortable for yourself in prison? I know I probably would. Lucky did get into at least one spot of bother in prison. His assistant and co-defendant, Petillo, who prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey described as a desperate killer, formed a prison gang of Italian criminals who often dished out severe beatings and stabbings to other inmates. Although Lucky usually stayed out of the trouble, during a tense fight in the rec yard, he intervened and attempted to end the conflict. But Petillo swung at him with a baseball bat. Fortunately for Luciano, and probably fortunately for Petillo, another con stepped in the way and gave Petillo a good beating. Would you be brave enough or stupid enough to attempt to hit the Godfather with a baseball bat? I wouldn't. Luciano also used his influence for good at Dannemora. He produced the materials to build a church at the prison, which became famous for being one of the only freestanding churches in the New York State correctional system, and interestingly, on the church's altar are two of the original doors from the 16th century vessel Victoria, which was the first ship to circumnavigate the globe. Lucky got a lucky break when America entered the Second World War, because there was a real fear that the enemy would infiltrate and sabotage the country's waterfronts. As the mob ruled the unions and controlled the docks, and Luciano effectively controlled the mob, he was identified as the main person to help the US Navy counter the threat. Negotiations with Luciano began in 1942, April of 1942, and he was transferred from Dannemora to Great Meadow Correctional Facility in Comstock on 12th of May. What a great name, the Great Meadow. Not only was the title of the prison more appealing, but it was much more comfortable and convenient than Dannemora. The delighted Luciano revelled in having hot water in his cell and decent toilet paper for the first time in 6 years. In return, Luciano gave the go-ahead for his henchmen to give every assistance possible to naval intelligence. Unlike other inmates, Luciano's visitors were taken to the prison warden's office, where they would wait for the high-profile gangster to arrive. The meeting took place in a large room next to the warden's office. The 2 guards waited outside and the door was locked so the mobsters couldn't be heard or disturbed. Luciano also provided valuable intel on his native Sicily, which assisted the Allied invasion of Sicily. Because of the aid he'd given the military, Luciano was released early from his sentence shortly after the war ended. But due to not legally being a US citizen, he was deported to Italy. Luciano exited Great Meadow and returned to Sing Sing on the 9th of January 1946. According to an Associate Press reporter, Luciano arrived at Sing Sing with his finger manicured, wearing a jeweled wristwatch and ring. He was accompanied by 1 guard on his prison journey. Shortly after, he was taken from Sing Sing to an undisclosed location on Ellis Island to await deportation. He was allowed visitors there. Costello was one, but no reporters were allowed to see him, much to the annoyance of the press. One of the press pack tried to ignore the ban and was physically thrown out by the guards when he attempted to see Lucky. When asked why Costello had permission to visit Luciano, Lloyd Jensen, chief of the Detention, Deportation and Parole Division, told the press that he personally authorized the visit, adding, "Luciano was here as a deportee, not as a criminal. Like everybody else, he received visitors in a public room with a guard standing by." On the 8th of February, after 9.5 years in prison, Luciano boarded the Liberty ship Laura Keene. According to newspaper reporter Art Smith, an entourage of 6 men led by boss of the Ruthless Murder Incorporated, Albert Anastasia, boarded the ship around 8 p.m. Smith said Luciano delivered a farewell speech in which he said, "I'm really glad to be getting out of this country. I will be a free son of a bitch. I will be a free man in Italy, even though I do not intend to stay there long." The Laura Keene set sail the next morning. Luciano arrived in Naples on the 28th of February. So there we have it, the story of Lucky Luciano's prison years. It was clearly an unpleasant experience for Lucky, but not as bad as it could have been for him. I imagine if he were alive today and we asked him what he was most thankful for, he probably would have said the Second World War. If the war hadn't happened, then he would have stayed in prison for at least 20 more years probably. He was a very lucky boy. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're interested in reading about Lucky Luciano, I'll put some links to some good books in the description box below. Please do like, subscribe and comment, and look out for more content on Shooting the Dice channel. Please comment with suggestions for any interviews or videos you'd like to see in the future. And if you enjoy the content and would like to donate to the channel, then a PayPal link is in the description box. That will be much appreciated. Until next time, all the best.